It was a chilly evening in Washington, D.C. when the first whispers of a scandal began to emerge. A dinner party, thrown by none other than the controversial political figure Pam Bondi, would set the stage for a political earthquake that would shake the foundations of the legal world. Pam Bondi, a former Attorney General of Florida and a fiery conservative firebrand, had long been a thorn in the side of many progressive politicians. But this time, she had something much bigger in mind. She was about to drop a bombshell that would expose one of the highest-ranking figures in the New York state government, Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York. Bondi had always been a sharp strategist, using every tool at her disposal to make waves in the political arena. But her target this time wasn't just a rival, it was someone who had taken aim at the very heart of the political establishment. Letitia James, who had gained national attention for her aggressive investigations into high-profile figures and corporations, had made a name for herself as a fearless crusader for justice. However, Bondi knew something the public didn't. The dinner party was meant to be a gathering of friends and allies. But as the evening went on, Bondi couldn't hide her excitement. Her plan was set in motion, and she was prepared to watch it unfold with the precision of a political mastermind. As the guests mingled, Bondi slipped out to take a call. Her expression grew serious as she listened intently. When she hung up, her eyes sparkled with a hint of something sinister. She had just been handed the key to unraveling James' carefully constructed empire. Later that night, Bondi took the stage, her voice calm but laced with venom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her words hanging in the air. "What I'm about to tell you will change the way you see politics in this country. Letitia James, the so-called champion of justice, is hiding a truth that will shatter her career." The room fell silent. The tension was palpable as Bondi set the stage for what would come next. The room, once filled with the clinking of glasses and idle chatter, now buzzed with a new energy. Pam Bondi's words hung in the air, thick with anticipation. The quiet murmur of the guests grew louder, but no one dared to interrupt. Bondi, always the showwoman, paced slowly in front of the crowd. She wasn't just delivering a speech, she was setting the trap, drawing the audience in. "I know you're all wondering," Bondi continued, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "What could possibly bring down a figure as untouchable as Letitia James?" She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes scanning the room, making sure every pair of eyes was on her. "The answer is simple: hypocrisy." The guests exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Bondi knew how to keep them hooked, and she wasn't about to let go. "I've spent months digging, watching, and waiting for the right moment. And now, the moment has come." You see, while Letitia James was out there playing the role of the fearless prosecutor, she was quietly playing her own game, one that not only compromises her position, but also her entire integrity. A murmur rippled through the room. Bondi could almost taste the confusion in the air, but she was far from finished. She took money, lots of it, from entities she was supposed to be investigating. Not just pocket change either, but substantial sums from the very corporations and individuals she claimed to hold accountable. "That's right," she said, leaning in closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "Letitia James has been caught red-handed in a scheme of political pay-to-play." Bondi paused, her words sinking in as the room's atmosphere shifted from disbelief to shock. She took out a stack of documents from her bag and held them up for everyone to see. The papers were heavy with details, dates, signatures, financial records, all meticulously compiled, all damning. She handed them out to the front row of guests. "Here you go, folks," Bondi said with a sly grin. "Proof. Hard evidence of her corruption, hidden in plain sight for those who have the stomach to look." The guests shuffled the papers between themselves, their faces a mix of curiosity and disbelief. The silence was deafening as Bondi let them digest what she had just revealed. "But that's not all," she said, savoring the moment. "I'm only scratching the surface. The deeper you go, the more you'll find. Letitia James isn't the champion she pretends to be. She's a puppet, and her strings are being pulled by the highest bidders in the corporate world. The room was now in chaos. Whispers erupted in every corner, and eyes turned from Bondi to one another, unsure of what to believe. But there was one thing everyone knew: Letitia James' reputation, the one she had worked so hard to build, was on the verge of collapsing. The news spread like wildfire. What had started as a quiet dinner party turned into the political scandal of the decade. The following morning, the media was buzzing with reports of Pam Bondi's explosive accusations. Headlines screamed, "Letitia James exposed, a career built on corruption." The stories were everywhere, dominating every news outlet. Letitia James, once a towering figure in the world of progressive politics, found herself facing a tidal wave of public scrutiny. Calls for her resignation came from both sides of the political aisle. For years, she had been a symbol of accountability, a champion of the oppressed, and now, she was being painted as a fraud. Her carefully curated image of integrity was shattered, reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. As James sat in her office, watching the news coverage, a sense of dread washed over her. She had worked so hard to get to where she was. All of it, her rise to power, her public persona, was on the line. The documents Bondi had revealed were damning, but James had always thought she had been careful, never leaving a trail that could be followed. But Bondi had found it. Every secret, every misstep, every compromise. It was all there, laid out for the world to see. There was no way she could explain away the evidence. There was no spin, no clever wordplay that would undo the damage. Her career was on the line, and the only thing she could do now was fight back. The pressure mounted as calls for an official investigation into James' actions flooded in. But even as the political world closed in on her, James refused to go down without a fight. She called a press conference, determined to salvage whatever shred of credibility she had left. "I want to address these allegations head-on," James began, her voice steady but clearly strained. The press pool hung on her every word. "What Pam Bondi is trying to do is nothing more than a political smear campaign. This is a desperate attempt to discredit me, to undermine the work I've done for the people of New York." But the room wasn't buying it. The reporters fired off question after question, pressing her on the documents, on the accusations of corruption. Every answer seemed more rehearsed than the last. James knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. She couldn't hide forever. And then, the unthinkable happened. A leak. The documents Bondi had presented at the dinner party were verified, cross-referenced, and confirmed by an anonymous source within the New York state government. James' worst fear had come true. The allegations were not only true, they were worse than anyone had anticipated. As the evidence mounted, the pressure on James became unbearable. The calls for her resignation grew louder. Her own allies began to distance themselves from her, no longer willing to defend a person whose credibility had been completely destroyed. The days following the revelation were a blur for Letitia James. The political storm she had weathered for so long had turned into a full-blown hurricane. Her office was flooded with calls, some from colleagues, others from enemies eager to see her fall. Her personal phone rang off the hook, the relentless noise of her career crashing down around her. She tried to hold her ground, giving interviews, issuing statements of defiance, but the tide was too strong. Her allies, once vocal and united, began to quietly slip away, one by one. High-profile figures who had stood by her side now distanced themselves from the scandal, fearing that even their association with her could taint their own careers. James knew she could no longer keep up the facade. Every speech, every press release felt like a hollow attempt to stem the tide, to keep control of a narrative that was slipping out of her grasp. The truth, as ugly as it was out there. And with it, the slow unraveling of her political career. Then came the final blow. At a press conference that was supposed to mark her defense, a former associate, someone she had trusted, stepped forward to confirm everything. Thomas McAllister, a former aide who had worked closely with James for years, stood before the cameras, his voice steady but full of regret. "I was part of the system that allowed this to happen," McAllister said, his eyes never leaving the cameras. Letitia James wasn't just making deals behind closed doors, she was actively involved in a network of corporate influence that shaped policy decisions. I watched her take money from donors she was supposed to be investigating. I watched as she played both sides, pretending to be the voice of the people while selling out those very people for her own gain. The room fell silent. It was a betrayal that no one saw coming. McAllister's words, backed by the documents Bondi had released, were the final confirmation the public needed. The once proud Attorney General of New York, who had built a career on exposing corruption, was now the one exposed. She was finished. Within hours, James held a somber press conference, this time with no defiance in her voice. The fight had drained from her. "I have decided to resign from my position as Attorney General," James said, her tone flat, devoid of emotion. "The people of New York deserve better than what I have become. I will not continue to hold office when my actions have undermined the trust they placed in me." Her resignation was a formality at that point. It was inevitable. The weight of the scandal had crushed her, and there was no way out. In one final act, she disappeared from the public eye, leaving behind the wreckage of a once promising career. Pam Bondi, meanwhile, watched the whole thing unfold with a sense of vindication. Her gamble had paid off. Letitia James, the figure who had once been seen as untouchable, had been brought to her knees by a careful, calculated move. Bondi had played her cards perfectly, exposing James for what she truly was, a politician driven not by justice, but by personal gain. As the media turned to the next scandal, the fallout from James' exposure continued to echo through the corridors of power. The legal community, once behind her, was now questioning their own judgment. Trust in the system was shaken, but Pam Bondi, the architect of James' fall, had already moved on to the next battle, knowing full well that in politics, the only thing that mattered was the game, and she was the one still standing. The world moved on quickly, as it always does in the high-stakes world of politics. But the aftershocks of Letitia James' fall from grace reverberated through the halls of power for weeks to come. It wasn't just her resignation that had shocked the nation, it was the manner in which she had been taken down. Her carefully constructed image had crumbled, and now, all that remained were the remnants of a career built on shaky foundations. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, was basking in the aftermath of her victory. Her name was everywhere. News outlets praised her for exposing James, calling her a political savant and the woman who took down the untouchable. She was offered interviews, book deals, and speaking engagements. The tables had turned. She was no longer just a former attorney general, she was now a powerhouse in the Republican Party, with an influential voice in the political landscape. But Bondi knew better than to rest on her laurels. The political game, after all, was never about winning a single battle, it was about positioning for the next move. She had secured her place in the limelight, but that was just the beginning. There were other figures in her sights. She wasn't done yet. She had learned long ago that in politics, allies were temporary, and enemies were often more useful than friends. Behind closed doors, Bondi made strategic moves. She began aligning herself with key conservative figures, working behind the scenes to establish new partnerships and gain access to even more power. She didn't need to make public statements or dramatic gestures, she was playing a long game, one where influence was just as important as public victories. And in her mind, the real war was still ahead. Meanwhile, Letitia James was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She retreated from the public eye entirely, a shadow of the powerful figure she had once been. Her reputation, once held in such high regard, was now irreparably damaged. There were whispers about her future. Would she attempt a comeback? Would she fade into obscurity? No one knew for certain. But what was clear was that her political career was over. In the months that followed, investigations into James' actions continued. Some even speculated that she might face legal consequences for the allegations that had been made. But the once dominant figure who had spearheaded high-profile investigations into corruption was now the one under scrutiny. The irony was impossible to ignore, and the public relished every moment of it. She was the story everyone loved to talk about, and the story everyone loved to watch burn. Yet there were those who still defended her, quietly and behind closed doors. A few of her old allies, those who had stuck by her in her rise to power, continued to offer their support, but it wasn't enough. The damage was done. And as the months wore on, Letitia James' name became a cautionary tale in the political world, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, was immune to the wrath of an opponent like Pam Bondi. As for Bondi, she had proven one thing above all: in politics, there were no lasting victories, only opportunities. And she was already eyeing her next target. Months after Letitia James' fall from grace, the world had seemingly moved on. The media had shifted its focus to new scandals, new investigations, and new political figures to scrutinize. But for those who played the game behind the scenes, there was more to the story than just the public spectacle of a political career imploding. Pam Bondi, now a key figure in conservative circles, was not content to simply rest on her laurels. While the spotlight had briefly shone on her as the architect of James' downfall, Bondi knew that in politics, you could never allow yourself to be a one-hit wonder. She needed more influence, more power, and most importantly, more leverage. Letitia James was just a stepping stone in the larger plan she was meticulously crafting. Bondi had quickly earned the trust of some of the most powerful conservative backers. A select group of wealthy donors, political strategists, and shadowy figures now looked to her as a rising star who had the ambition and the cunning to change the course of political history. She was meeting with influential players behind closed doors, making deals that would shape the future of the GOP. In these private meetings, Bondi was more than just a politician. She was a master of manipulation. Her ability to navigate power dynamics and broker alliances was unparalleled. She knew that to truly rise to the top, she would have to play the long game. And she had learned from the best. She had studied the failures and successes of those who had come before her, absorbing their strategies, understanding their weaknesses, and positioning herself as the one person who could unite fractured factions within the party. But Bondi's ambitions weren't limited to just climbing the political ladder. She knew that power was not simply about positions or titles, it was about control. Control over policy, control over the narrative, control over the direction of the nation. And she had already started laying the groundwork to achieve that. Meanwhile, the remnants of Letitia James' career were fading into the background. The former Attorney General had become a figure of ridicule, an example of political failure and corruption. Her name, once associated with bold investigations and political courage, was now synonymous with scandal. However, James wasn't done yet. Despite her public silence, she was quietly plotting her comeback. She had spent the last few months meeting with old friends, political consultants, and legal experts, trying to find a way to salvage her career. But the road to redemption was steep, and the stain of her fall was not easily erased. There were murmurs about her running for a lower-profile position, perhaps even an attempt at regaining some level of influence within the Democratic Party. But James knew she would have to fight against the tide of public opinion, and it was a battle she wasn't sure she could win. In the shadows, a group of her old allies began to rally around her, forming a discreet support network. They knew the political game well. The key to survival was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment hadn't come yet. Letitia James might have fallen, but she had no intention of staying down. She wasn't ready to disappear. Pam Bondi, however, was watching. She had always been 2 steps ahead, and she saw the faintest glimmer of a threat in James' quiet determination. But Bondi wasn't worried. She had already made moves to ensure that any attempt at a comeback would be blocked. She had her own backers, her own network, and she would not allow someone like James to rise from the ashes of her own destruction. The political chessboard was shifting again, and both women were now part of a much larger, more complex game than they had ever imagined. In the quiet corridors of power, the stakes were getting higher. While the public watched in fascination as Pam Bondi continued to climb the political ladder, and Letitia James struggled to regain some semblance of her former glory, a different kind of battle was taking place, one that no one was fully aware of. Bondi, ever the strategist, had long realized that her influence could only go so far without the right alliances. She had already secured the backing of wealthy donors and influential conservative figures, but now she needed something deeper, a movement, a base of unwavering supporters who would propel her into the highest echelons of power. To achieve this, she began to court rising stars within the party, young, dynamic politicians with an eye for the future and a hunger for success. Bondi wasn't just building a network of allies, she was grooming the next generation of GOP leaders. But the groundwork for her ascension was not without its challenges. Some of her newfound allies, while eager for power, were not always as loyal as she had hoped. A few questioned her methods, her ruthlessness, and her willingness to do whatever it took to win. These whispers of doubt were troubling, but Bondi, ever the tactician, had anticipated this. She knew that not every ally would stay loyal forever, but that didn't matter. What mattered was securing enough of them to keep the power moving in her direction. For now, Bondi was in control, but she understood that power was fluid. The real danger would come when those closest to her began to see her as a threat rather than an asset. Meanwhile, Letitia James was not entirely isolated. Her brief public silence had allowed her to regroup and strategize. She had a plan, one that would slowly start to unfold in the shadows. James wasn't about to fade quietly into oblivion. She had spent her career taking down powerful figures, and she wasn't about to let one scandal destroy everything she had worked for. Behind the scenes, she began working with a team of high-powered consultants and media experts, slowly rebranding herself. Her approach was subtle but powerful. Instead of attempting to regain the public's favor by confronting Bondi directly, she began to rebuild her image as an advocate for reform. She reached out to progressive groups, worked on policies aimed at tackling corruption, and began speaking out against the very corporate interests she had once been accused of colluding with. James knew she couldn't erase the damage done by the scandal, but she could reposition herself as the very thing Bondi feared, an advocate for the people. It wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about redefining who she was in the eyes of those who still saw potential in her. Slowly, but surely, the whispers about her comeback began to grow. She started to garner support from some of the progressive factions within the Democratic Party, who viewed her as a symbol of redemption, a cautionary tale turned hero. Bondi, however, was keenly aware of the possibility of James rising again. As much as she had used her power to destroy James' career, she knew that James was not easily defeated. The subtlety of James' approach, her quiet work behind the scenes, posed a threat that Bondi wasn't ready to ignore. Bondi's next move was critical. She needed to solidify her hold over the GOP, and she needed to keep James in check. If James regained her footing, it could spell disaster for Bondi's ambitions. To ensure James wouldn't make a comeback, Bondi leveraged her influence within the media, pushing out narratives that painted James as a disgraced former politician whose attempts at redemption were merely a ploy to regain power. She had learned from her previous battles, the media was a tool, and in her hands, it could be devastating. James wasn't unaware of Bondi's tactics, of course. She had expected the media attacks, but she was patient. Her allies were quietly gaining strength. The groundwork for a political resurgence was being laid, and with each passing day, Letitia James was growing more confident in her ability to overcome the mess that had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. And so, in this unseen battle, both women prepared for the inevitable confrontation, a contest for control, for the future of their political legacies. Bondi, the master strategist, and James, the survivor, each playing their cards, waiting for the right moment to strike. The stage was set. After months of whispers, subtle moves, and calculated maneuvering, the ultimate showdown between Pam Bondi and Letitia James was about to unfold. The two women had long been locked in a quiet battle for power, but now, it was becoming clear that there would be only one victor. For Bondi, the stakes were monumental. She had spent years building her empire within the GOP, securing her place as a key player in conservative politics. She had weathered the storm of her past, and now, her eyes were fixed on higher office. The media, the donors, and the rising stars of the party had all rallied behind her. She was the future of the GOP, a woman who had proven time and again that she could outmaneuver her opponents. But then there was Letitia James. After months of public silence, she had re-emerged, subtly but surely. The whisper campaigns about her comeback had been gaining steam. Progressive factions, disillusioned with the state of their party, saw in James a symbol of resistance, a figure who could rise from the ashes and reclaim her place in politics. James wasn't just trying to redeem her name, she was positioning herself as the antithesis of everything Bondi stood for. She was the fighter who had survived the political storm, and she wasn't about to let a woman like Bondi erase her from the political stage. The final confrontation came during a televised debate, a rare event that would see the two women face each other in public for the first time in years. The stakes could not have been higher. The debate was seen as the moment that would determine their political futures, and millions of eyes were watching. It wasn't just about politics anymore, it was personal. Bondi was the first to speak. She stood confidently at the podium, her demeanor calm, composed, and calculated. Letitia James has shown us all that power corrupts, she began, her voice firm. She might try to reframe her past, to pretend she didn't betray the very people who trusted her, but we all know better. She wasn't a champion of justice. She was part of the problem. James, poised and sharp, didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment her entire life. Pam Bondi is a woman who thrives on division. She profits from chaos. She has built her entire career on tearing down others to lift herself up, James shot back. But I believe in the power of redemption, in fighting for the people who have been forgotten. And that's why I'm here today, because we deserve better than what people like Pam Bondi offer. The room was electric with tension. Bondi, with her polished rhetoric and battle-hardened experience, was a formidable opponent. But James, with her conviction and passion for justice, was a force that could not be ignored. As the debate continued, it became clear that neither woman would back down. Bondi attacked James' past, pointing to the corruption scandals that had nearly destroyed her, while James countered by attacking Bondi's ties to corporate interests and the hypocrisy of her supposed moral high ground. Each woman struck hard, but it was clear that the battle wasn't just about policies, it was about who could capture the public's trust. The turning point came when James, in a surprising move, brought up Bondi's own history, her role in defending powerful figures during her time as Attorney General. She knew the specifics of Bondi's past, and she used them to undercut Bondi's self-righteous posture. Pam, you've been paid handsomely by the same corporate interests you claim to oppose. You've played the game, just like everyone else. You think you're above it all, but we know the truth. Bondi's composure faltered, just for a moment. It was subtle, but it was enough. The crowd, once in Bondi's corner, began to murmur. The crack in her armor was visible, and it only took a second for the media to pick up on it. The debate ended in a tense silence, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. Public opinion began to turn, slowly at first, then with a growing sense of momentum. James had fought not just for redemption, but for something deeper, a chance to prove that she could rise from the ashes and stand for the values she once fought for. In the days following the debate, James' popularity surged. Her message of redemption resonated with a public disillusioned with the status quo, while Bondi found her carefully constructed political empire beginning to crack. The media, which had once lauded Bondi as the political mastermind, now focused on her vulnerabilities. The pressure mounted as her alliances began to fray, and whispers of dissent within her ranks began to grow louder. James, however, had the wind at her back. The final battle had been fought, and while the path ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear, she was not finished. Her career, her fight, and her comeback were just beginning. Bondi had lost this round, but the political game was far from over. In the end, both women would leave their mark on the political landscape, but only one would truly control the future. And in this world of shifting allegiances and constant power struggles, no one ever stays at the top for long.